Guten Tag, APUSH. We have a new video today. It's the bee's knees by the big cheese himself, Mr. Linegar. Let's make history today as we jot over our period 8 and 9, which is the Unit 7 review video. But first, let's do our daily punishment. Why don't vampires go to barbecues? They don't like steak. Let's get started. Period 8 overview. We're going to be going over two periods now. This is our very last unit. Period 8, which covers 1945 to 1980, and Period 9, which covers 1980 to present. Period 8. It's roughly 10 to 17% of the exam, like the previous units. Essay topics can include American foreign policy, compared to other time periods, the Cold War, civil rights. Why was 1945 to 1980 chosen? 1945, end of World War II, shift in U.S. foreign policy, the Cold War. 1980, the election of Ronald Reagan, the beginning of a new conservative movement. This time period focuses on the Cold War, such as Korea and Vietnam, the civil rights movement, gay rights, women's rights, the Hispanic civil rights movement, Native American civil rights movement, the Great Society, political scandals and controversies like Watergate, stagflation, all that good stuff. Let's first start talking about the World War II economy, post-World War II. There's going to be a prosperous economy after World War II, which will be caused by federal spending from World War II, the baby boom, new technological developments. You're going to have improved higher education. During World War II, they created the GI Bill, which is going to provide money for loans for houses and free college for returning World War II veterans. You're going to have an increase of people moving to the Sun Belt, which is mostly in the South and the West. People are migrating there. You should know the Sun Belt. That's the Sun Belt right there. There's going to be challenges to conformity by groups in the 1950s, like the beatniks. When we get to the 1960s, we have the hippies. So some of the foreign policy after World War II, this was created by the idea of George F. Kennan. After World War II, the Soviets are not going to follow through with their promises in Yalta, and they're not going to give free elections to Eastern European countries. Harry Truman is going to see the Soviet Union, Russia, as a danger and aggressive, similar to the Nazis. So he's going to have a hardline anti-communist foreign policy. He's going to implement the Truman Doctrine that says America will give financial and military aid to any country resisting communism. A lot of his big foreign policy goes around Kennan's idea of containment. The idea of containment is we need to stop the spread of communism where it's not at yet and stop it from spreading. Truman also does things like the Marshall Plan, which helped to economically rebuild Western Europe to prevent them from becoming communist. America will be focused on collective security and economic frameworks to help non-communist nations. We do the Marshall Plan. We're going to create an alliance system called NATO. In Asia, we create Seattle. NATO was an alliance between several Western European countries and the United States. First ever peacetime alliance. We talked about the Marshall Plan and Truman Doctrine. The U.S. will seek to support non-communist governments, even if they weren't the most democratic. So, for example, we'll help out. We're going to lead to overthrows, a coup in the 1950s in Iran, to install an anti-communist government under the Shah. We'll support Batista in the 1940s and 1950s in Cuba. We'll support the South Vietnamese government because they were non-communist. Tension between America and communist Russia will fluctuate between confrontation and détente. For example, you have things like the Cuban Missile Crisis, where America almost went to war with Russia because of nuclear bombs Russia was putting in Cuba. You have examples of détente, like the SALT treaties, where America and Russia are trying to improve relationships, so it does fluctuate. Both America and Russia will seek allies amongst new decolonized countries. Some countries, like India, will try to be non-aligned. India, Egypt, they'll do the non-alignment movement, Bangladesh Conference. A lot of countries and former colonies will have to choose between supporting America or communist Russia. America will support non-communist governments in Latin America, even if they weren't the most democratic, as long as they were non-communist. America will get involved in the Middle East as well, and will support countries like Israel. Um, we also support dictatorships in the Middle East that were non-communist. Eventually, because of our support of Israel, there'll be the 1973 oil embargo, which is going to be a big deal in the 70s. Both political parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, will support containing communism. However, the debate emerged over how to root out communism. This is going to be the second Red Scare. You're going to have the second Red Scare with McCarthyism, the House of Un-American Activities Committee. People will be prosecuted, like the Rosenbergs, for giving away state secrets, Alger Hiss. There'll be the Korean War. America and the United Nations will go to war against North Korea because North Korea unjustly invades South Korea. America will be able to push them back, then China gets involved, and the war ends where it began. Another example is the Vietnam War. After the Geneva Conference, Vietnam will be divided into two countries. Eventually, North Vietnam will launch guerrilla warfare in South Vietnam. America will send in more and more soldiers. Finally, under LBJ, we're going to start doing bombing and sending real soldiers in. By 1968, with the Tet Offensive, it's kind of showing that the war was not winnable. There's going to be more protests in the United States. Under Nixon, he's going to bomb Cambodia. He does Vietnamization. One of the things Dwight D. Eisenhower worried about as he left the presidency was the military-industrial complex. This was his warning about the increased military spending during peacetime, and how like his fear that the military, that whole mindset could really dominate the government. There will be debates about executive branch power during Cold War proxy fights, like during the Vietnam War, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. It's eventually going to lead to things like the War Powers Act. Protests will be common during the Vietnam War, especially as it dragged on. After 1968, after the Tet Offensive, even though Americans and South Vietnamese are going to win these battles, it does show that we're not close to winning the war, and public opinion will really turn against the Vietnam War. There'll be college protests, and some of these will lead to massacres. The Kent State Massacre is a good example in the 1970s, where some people were shot, some protesters, college students, were shot by the Ohio National Guard. We also have civil rights during this time. There are many strategies: legal challenges, direct action, and nonviolent protest. All three branches of government are going to start to promote civil rights, especially under Lyndon Baines Johnson. The first real example of civil rights in this unit was Executive Order 9981. This is where Harry Truman desegregated the military. We have the Supreme Court case Brown v. Board of Education, which gets rid of Plessy v. Ferguson, which says separate but equal is inherently unequal. We have the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is supposed to ban discrimination. It banned discrimination based on race, religion, sex, or national origin. There will be white resistance to desegregation. Even though desegregation was made illegal with Brown v. Board of Education, Southerners will resist this. They'll turn to things like violence. Also, there'll be other kind of resistance. Southern Congress people and senators signed the Southern Manifesto, where they refused to support Brown v. Board of Education. The governor of Arkansas refuses to let African Americans into Little Rock High School. Eisenhower has to call the National Guard. That's Little Rock 9, Central High School. There's going to be debates amongst activists after 1965 whether nonviolence is the best tactic. And this is going to lead to more radical groups like the Black Panthers, Malcolm X. We also have women's rights during this time. Betty Friedan wrote The Feminine Mystique, which is going to challenge the 1950s cult of domesticity, the idea that women should just be in the house, cooking, cleaning, and having children. For gays and lesbians, we have the Stonewall Riot in 1969. Police like to raid gay bars, and in this riot specifically, the gay community fought back. This is going to lead to the gay rights movement. Latinos, we have Cesar Chavez, He led a civil rights movement for agricultural Hispanic people that were working in agriculture. You also have groups like LULAC. American Indians, you have the Indians of all tribes, Ayet, and also the AIM. They used protest. They actually invaded places like Alcatraz and the massacre at Wounded Knee to bring attention to their civil rights movement. Also, there was awareness of poverty. Michael Harrington, a socialist, wrote The Other Half, The Other America, about the poverty in parts of America. This is going to actually influence Lyndon Baines Johnson's Great Society. The Great Society is a good example of what we consider modern-day liberalism, using the government to promote social well-being. It's going to reach its zenith under the Great Society. It's going to seek to indiscrimination. We talked about this before. They're going to have the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Voting Rights Act will eliminate things like literacy tests and actually gives the government power to enforce it. Another big part of the Great Society is to eliminate poverty. You're going to have food stamps, Medicare, Medicaid. They want to fix education. You're going to have the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, more governmental involvement in education. This is really the nationalization of education. You also have like immigration reform. You're going to have Johnson get rid of a lot of the quota system that we had from the 1920s for immigration. With the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965, some people on the left felt liberals did not go far enough to change society, racially and economically. For example, the Black Panthers, the Students for a Democratic Society, are going to criticize them for not going far enough, for there still being a lot of poverty in African American communities. The Supreme Court decision will expand democracy and individual freedoms. You have Griswold v. Connecticut. This is where the Supreme Court struck down laws prohibiting birth control. It established the concept of right to privacy. Miranda v. Arizona said that you have to read an accuser their rights when you arrest them. You also have things like Gideon v. Wainwright, which says that you have to provide a lawyer. You had some Supreme Court cases that said that you cannot have church, you cannot have prayer in school. The Supreme Court's cases were very liberal. Later on, we're going to talk about Roe v. Wade, right to an abortion, which was recently overturned. The impact of the Great Society and the Supreme Court decisions will help motivate the conservative movement. A lot of the conservatives did not like these decisions. They thought they were anti-family, and they thought they were coddling the criminals. In the 1950s, you do have the image of a nuclear family. 2 children, suburbs, like, the Levittowns, stay-at-home mom. The reality is much different, however. Women are going to work more and more as time went on, pink-collar ghetto. You do have counterculture in the 1960s, the hippies. They challenged their parents' generation's ideals. They were baby boomers. They used drugs and instituted a sexual revolution. There will be debate amongst conservative and liberals over all these social values and these changes in values and norms. An example of a Supreme Court case during this time, going back from last slide, is Bach v. Bach v. the University of California. This was the Supreme Court decision that did allow affirmative action in allowing who you accept to college. It did overturn the quota system for minority applicants. It said you can't just allow a minority into college just because they need to have a certain number of African Americans in college. So in that way, it was a defeat for people that support affirmative action. It did say, though, however, that you could look in race as one of the qualifying factors. So if people were equally qualified, race could be the plus thing that allows an African American or Hispanic person or somebody that's historically marginalized to be accepted into college. We have the Immigration Act of 1965, which I talked about. This reverses the quota system of the 1920s. It's going to favor people from Asia and Latin America. Rachel Carson's Silent Springs. This is going to bring awareness to the environmental movement. It talks about the danger of DDT in rivers and springs and how it destroys the natural environment. It's going to help lead to the green movement. It's going to help lead to the creation of the EPA, the Clean Air Act, and the Clean Water Act. Let's talk about some key people from this unit. George Kennan, father of the containment theory. George Marshall, Secretary of State under Harry Truman. He did the Marshall Plan. Eisenhower's farewell address. This is where he warned against the military-industrial complex. The Shah of Iran was the leader after the CIA overthrew the Mohammed Mossadegh, and he became like the puppet that America put in Iran. This is going to make Iran very angry at the United States, which will eventually help cause the Iranian Revolution in 1979. Ho Chi Minh is going to be the communist leader of North Vietnam and is going to push for all Vietnam to become communist and independent. We have Rosa Parks. She's the person that was first arrested that leads to the Montgomery bus boycott. Martin Luther King Jr. was the leader of the SCLC. He did the Montgomery bus boycott, the March on Washington. He was the big leader of nonviolent civil disobedience. Emmett Till is a black teenager that was brutally murdered in the South. The Little Rock Nine were 9 African-American students that went to Little Rock High School. After it was desegregated, only one of them will graduate. Malcolm X is going to advocate black nationalism and separatism from whites and fighting violence with violence. He will later change his views a little bit before he's assassinated. You should know Betty Friedan, the feminine mystique. Rachel Carson, Silent Spring. Phyllis Schlafly is going to try to stop the Equal Rights Amendment. We have the Beat Generation in the 1950s. They criticized middle-class consumerism. LBJ did the Great Society. He also escalated the Vietnam War. In the Immigration Act of 1965, they're going to overturn the quota systems from the 1920s. That means there's going to be more people coming to the United States, predominantly from Latin America and Asia. Now let's talk about period 9, 1980 to present. This is roughly 4 to 6% of the exam. So these two periods together does make this our largest unit. We could talk, there hasn't been any exclusive essays just over 1980 to present. There has been essays about Ronald Reagan, but it usually also bleeds in the 1970s on the conservative movement. So you might see an essay topic that includes like a little bit before and a little bit after. But you're probably not going to see like an essay of anything past Reagan, although it is possible. 1980 is chosen because it was the election of Ronald Reagan. It goes to present, which is today. This time period focuses on the end of the Cold War, Ronald Reagan, the conservative movement, and terrorism. So what are some reasons for the growth of the conservative movement? Decrease in public trust in government. You have things like Watergate, the Vietnam War, economic problems. We have the oil embargo, so we have stagflation, high unemployment, and high inflation in the 1970s. Political scandal, Watergate. You had all those papers released that showed the government was lying about the Vietnam War, the Pentagon Papers. Foreign policy failures like the Iranian hostage crisis under Jimmy Carter. Perceived social and moral decay. You have rising crime, juvenile delinquency. You have the rise of evangelical churches and the rise of fundamentalist Christians getting involved in politics, the moral majority. What are some conservatives' victories in this time period? You do have a reduction in taxes. This was Reagan's economic policy, Reaganomics, trickle-down economics, cut taxes for corporations, which will eventually increase money for everybody, also known as supply-side economics. They wanted to deregulate many industries, so like they do deregulate the airline industry. They will not be as successful as moral ideas. Abortion will remain legal in the 1980s. The Supreme Court will limit abortion a little bit with KCV Planned Parenthood, but it still keeps it. It's not until recently that abortion was made illegal Roe v. Wade will be overturned in Dobbs v. Jackson Women Health Organization. It does allow states to make abortion policies. So, like, abortion is not a guaranteed national right. There's not a right to privacy like there was with Roe v. Wade. Some states have kept abortion. Some states have gotten rid of it or put much more stringent actions against it. Denouncing big government. Even though conservatives favor smaller government, the size of government will continue to grow after 1980. A lot of this is because increased defense spending. It's also hard to eliminate popular programs like Medicare and Social Security. Reagan did try to eliminate Social Security, and he got a lot into trouble, and he had to back out from it. Let's talk about Reagan's presidency. Initially, Ronald Reagan did reject the idea of détente. He did not want to improve relationships with the Soviet Union. He saw them as an evil empire. He's going to increase spending on the Strategic Defense Initiative, also known as the Star Wars program. He's going to use bellicose rhetoric. He calls them the evil empire. In his second term, he will try to improve relationships with the new Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, and they actually will meet, and they'll actually start reducing weapons. They have the Washington Summit and the Reykjavik Summit. They will reduce weapons. The best example of this is the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty, the INF Treaty, which meant to eliminate intermediate range and short range missiles. So Reagan is going to reduce weapons with the Soviet Union. He thought Gorbachev was honest, and he was somebody he could do business with. After the Cold War, in 1991, the Soviet Union will collapse, Gorbachev will be kicked out, and Russia will become a democracy. Some people credit Reagan with that because his actions, like the Star Wars program, did help Russia to start increasing their military, and their economy was already pretty trash, and he kind of indirectly did bankrupt them. But after the Cold War, America is going to still be actively engaged in military and peacekeeping interventions. Under Bill Clinton, we'll be involved in Serbia, of NATO bombings of Milosevic, who was doing ethnic cleansing in Yugoslavia. America will get involved when Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait in the first Gulf War. After 9/11, America will be involved in lengthy conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. America, after 9/11, will have a whole concept of the war of terrorism, where we try to seek to eliminate terrorist threats from our country. This will lead to the passage of stuff like the Patriot Act, which gave the government permission to go in your house without a warrant and, go through your stuff. So there'll be debate over protection of civil liberties after 9/11. The economic inequality will increase after 1980 due to loss of manufacturing jobs. America's transitioning to white-collar jobs. We're outsourcing a lot of blue-collar jobs, like factory jobs. The middle class have seen their wages stagnate. There has been debate over free trade, whether it's beneficial or not, although economically everybody agrees free trade is a good thing. Under Bill Clinton, he signed NAFTA. This allowed for free trade with Canada and Mexico. There have been debates over government social safety nets. Some conservatives have pushed for Social Security reform because as it is now, Social Security, we're not able to pay for it. We just keep borrowing more and more money. Under President Obama, he did do the Affordable Health Care Act, which is not completely like universal health care, but is the closest we've ever gotten. Let's talk about some environmental and demographic changes. The Middle Eastern conflicts and climate change has led to debates over U.S. dependency on oil and fossil fuels. Immigrants from 1960 forward have largely been from Asia and Latin America. These are traditionally underrepresented groups. Under Ronald Reagan, even though he was a Republican, under Ronald Reagan, him and Congress will pass the Immigration Reform and Control Act of 1986, and Ronald Reagan will sign this. This granted individuals who had entered the country before January 1st, 1982 amnesty, and they made them U.S. citizens. This granted 2.7 million people legal status. They were hoping this would end the whole immigration thing, but now we just have more people come to the country as well, which is not a bad thing. But like now we have a new aspect of like undocumented people coming to the country. There's going to be population gains in the South and the West, the Sun Belt. Changes for homosexuals. Under Bill Clinton, Don't Ask, Don't Tell banned openly gay individuals from serving in the military. This will be overturned by President Obama. The gay marriage will be legalized in the Supreme Court decision, Obergefell v. Hodges. Let's talk about some key people from this time period, kiddos. Ronald Reagan, elected in 1980, advocated as a conservative for small government morality. In the present crisis, government is not the solution to our problems. Government is the problem. He wanted tax cuts, deregulation of industries, buildup of the military. Mikhail Gorbachev was the leader of the Soviet Union. He wanted to do glasnost, which is like more freedom of speech, in perestroika, where he allowed some capitalism in Russia. Don't Ask, Don't Tell. We talked about that. Osama bin Laden was the leader of Al-Qaeda. He's going to orchestrate the attacks on 9/11. Saddam Hussein was the leader of Iraq. He was suspected of having weapons of mass destruction. This will lead to the war in Iraq under George W. Bush. Was that Henry Clay? Oh my God, he's still around. Oh, we cannot get rid of him. All right, kiddos, and that's all I have for today. That was our last review video over Unit 7, which under the AP scope and sequence is period 8 and 9. Until next time, deuces. Deuces, yeah. It's pitch black like my soul.